You're standing in a crowd and something inside you quietly changes. Maybe it's a concert. Maybe it's a packed subway platform. Maybe it's just a crowded sidewalk during a parade. You feel it before you can name it, a kind of pull, a kind of release. You start moving with the group before you've decided to. Your voice gets louder, your inhibitions get smaller. And later, walking home alone, you might think, that wasn't really me back there. But here's the strange part, it absolutely was you. The crowd didn't replace you with someone else. It switched off a part of your brain that's usually running quietly in the background. And that switch is older than cities, older than written language, older than almost anything you'd call modern human culture. So, what actually happens to you in a crowd? For most of history, people assumed crowds simply brought out the worst in individuals. In 1895, a French social thinker named Gustave Le Bon published a book arguing that when people gather in large numbers, they stop thinking as individuals and start thinking as a single organism. He called it the group mind. According to Le Bon, the crowd doesn't just influence you, it temporarily becomes you. For decades, scientists treated this idea as mostly poetic exaggeration. Then, in the 1960s and 70s, researchers started testing it in laboratories, and what they found was even stranger than Le Bon's original theory. A psychologist named Philip Zimbardo ran a series of experiments on something he called de-individuation. The setup was simple. Take a group of people, hide their identities, sometimes with hoods, sometimes with name tags removed, sometimes just by placing them in darkness or in large groups where no one was being watched closely. Then give them a task where they could choose to act aggressively or not. The results were consistent. When people felt anonymous, they acted differently. Not slightly differently, dramatically differently. Behaviors that would normally feel embarrassing or wrong suddenly felt available. Not because the person had changed, but because the part of the brain responsible for self-monitoring had quietly stepped back. Think about that for a second. Self-monitoring isn't just a personality trait. It's a constant, exhausting background process. Every day your brain tracks how you're coming across. Are people watching? Will this be remembered? Will this be judged? That tracking shapes almost everything you do, often without you noticing it at all. Now imagine that process simply turning off. That's what a crowd does. Not because crowds are evil, but because crowds are loud, fast, and anonymous enough that your brain quietly concludes, no one is watching you specifically. And when no one is watching you specifically, an ancient calculation changes. This is where the story gets even stranger. Because this isn't just about aggression or chanting at a concert. It also explains one of the most disturbing patterns ever documented in psychology. Why people sometimes do nothing at all. In 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked near her apartment building in New York City. Newspaper reports at the time claimed dozens of neighbors heard her cries and did nothing. The exact details of that night have been debated and revised over the years. But the public reaction to the story sparked two researchers, John Darley and Bibb Latané, to ask a chilling question. Does having more witnesses make help more likely or less likely? Their experiments found something deeply counterintuitive. The more people who are present during an emergency, the less likely any single person is to step in. Researchers call this the bystander effect, and the mechanism behind it is something called diffusion of responsibility. When you're alone, responsibility lands entirely on you. When you're in a crowd, that same responsibility gets split into smaller and smaller pieces. Smaller pieces feel less urgent. Less urgent feels optional, and optional in the moment often means nothing happens at all. So, in one direction, crowds can make you bolder, louder, more willing to act. And in another direction, the exact same psychological mechanism can make you frozen, passive, and silent. How can the same mechanism produce opposite results? The answer has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with attention. A crowd doesn't make you good or bad. A crowd changes where your sense of personal responsibility goes. Sometimes it gets redirected outward, toward the energy of the group, and you act more freely than you would alone. Sometimes it gets diluted across everyone present, and you act less than you would alone. Either way, the individual version of you, the one that usually calculates consequences one decision at a time, has temporarily handed off control. Now, here's the part that makes all of this make sense. This mechanism is not a flaw in modern humans. It's a feature inherited from a world that no longer exists. For most of human history, you didn't live in cities of millions. You lived in small groups, often fewer than 150 people, where everyone knew everyone, and every action was witnessed by people who would remember it for years. In that world, self-monitoring wasn't exhausting. It was survival. Your reputation determined who shared food with you, who defended you, who you could marry, who would help raise your children. Being watched wasn't a threat. It was the entire structure of safety. But that same brain, built for groups of dozens, suddenly gets dropped into a stadium of 60,000 strangers, or a protest of 10,000 people, or a riot, or even just a busy city street. And the brain runs the only calculation it knows how to run. It scans for whether you specifically are being watched and remembered. In a true crowd, the honest answer is almost always no. So, the ancient safety mechanism, the one that kept small communities cooperative and accountable for hundreds of thousands of years, suddenly returns a different result. Not everyone sees you, but no one sees you. And when that switch flips, decades of personal restraint can loosen in minutes. This is also why crowd behavior spreads so fast. Once a few people start moving, chanting, or acting a certain way, others don't just notice. They unconsciously calibrate to it. Researchers studying crowd dynamics have found that people in dense groups often shift their walking pace, their volume, even their emotional expressions to match those immediately around them, often within seconds and without realizing it. Your brain isn't just losing self-monitoring, it's actively replacing it with monitoring of the group instead. And this brings everything back to today in a way that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Because crowds don't only exist in physical spaces anymore. Online, you can be surrounded by thousands of people without a single one of them knowing your face, your voice, or your name. Comment sections, group chats, anonymous forums, all of them recreate the exact same conditions that Zimbardo's experiments engineered with hoods and darkness. Anonymity, numbers, distance from consequences. The same ancient switch flips, except now it's flipping at a scale and a speed your ancestors never had to deal with. That's why arguments online can escalate faster than they would face to face. That's why people sometimes write things in comment sections they would never say out loud to another person's face. It's not that the internet creates new kinds of people. It's that the internet recreates one of the oldest psychological conditions in human history, anonymity inside a crowd, and your brain still responds to it the same way it always has. There's another layer to this, and it has to do with your body, not just your mind. When you're surrounded by a large group of people, your physiology starts to shift before you're even consciously aware of it. Heart rate synchronizes. Breathing patterns drift toward the rhythm of the people around you. Researchers studying audiences at live events have found that strangers sitting near each other with no conversation at all can end up with heart rates that rise and fall together over the course of a performance. Your nervous system is constantly listening to the room, even when your conscious mind is focused on something else entirely. Why would your body do this? Because for almost all of human history, staying in sync with the group wasn't a nice bonus. It was protection. A group that moved together, reacted together, and felt fear or excitement together could respond to danger faster than a collection of separate individuals, each running their own private calculations. If everyone around